There's a vegetable that most Americans have never heard of, and if you handed one to somebody and asked them to guess what it was, they'd probably say it was some kind of skinny parsnip or an odd-looking carrot. But if you peeled it, sliced it thin, and let them taste it raw, straight out of the ground, a lot of people describe the same thing, something sweet, something almost fruity, close to biting into an apple that's been drizzled with honey. That's not an exaggeration built for a thumbnail. That's genuinely how a lot of gardeners who've actually grown this thing describe the first bite. And the vegetable I'm talking about is called scarrot. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something, because this matters for your safety, not just your curiosity. Scarrot has a wild look-alike relative growing in ditches, roadsides, and untended fields across a huge portion of this country, commonly called wild parsnip. And wild parsnip is not something you want to touch carelessly, let alone eat. The sap contains compounds that react with sunlight on your skin and can cause serious burns, sometimes severe enough to blister and scar. So if anything in this video makes you want to go looking for this plant yourself, please hear this clearly. Source real scarrot seed or root divisions from a legitimate, reputable seed company. Do not go foraging along a roadside based on a vague resemblance. We'll come back to how to tell them apart and where to actually source the real thing later in this video, but I wanted that warning up front, not buried at the end. Okay, with that out of the way, let's actually talk about what scarrot is. Its botanical name is Siam cicerum. I'm mentioning that mostly because if you go looking to buy seed, especially from smaller heirloom catalogs, that Latin name is often how it's listed, sometimes alongside the common name and sometimes instead of it. Knowing that name helps you actually find the real plant instead of something similar sounding. Scarrot is a perennial root vegetable, and that word perennial is doing a lot of work here, so let's slow down on it. Most vegetables you grow in a garden, tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, beans, are annuals. They grow, they produce, they die, and next year you're buying a new packet of seed and starting the entire process over from scratch. A perennial vegetable doesn't work that way. Plant it once, and the same root system keeps coming back year after year on its own, without you replanting anything. Asparagus works this way, rhubarb works this way, and scarrot works this way too.
The root itself doesn't look like a single carrot-shaped taproot. Instead, it grows as a cluster of thin, finger-like roots radiating outward from a central crown, somewhat similar in shape to a bundle of thin parsnips or salsify roots bunched together at the top. Individually, each root finger is usually about the thickness of a finger, sometimes a bit thinner, and can grow anywhere from 6 inches to over a foot long depending on the growing conditions and how long it's been left in the ground. As for the flavor, cooked scarrot is often compared to a cross between a parsnip and a sweet potato, earthy, starchy, but noticeably sweeter than either one on their own. Raw and thinly sliced, that sweetness becomes even more pronounced, and it's here that the apple and honey comparison really comes from. A clean, natural sweetness without any of the bitterness or sharpness you'd expect from most raw root vegetables. Now, let's talk about where this plant actually came from, because its history is genuinely interesting, and it's older and more widespread than a lot of people realize. Scarrot isn't originally native to North America. Its origins trace back to Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, and it was cultivated for centuries in various forms across Europe before European colonists ever set foot in the Americas. By the time it made its way to colonial and early American kitchen gardens, it was already a long-established crop with generations of cultivation history behind it. Once here, it found a particularly strong foothold among certain rural farming communities, most notably Pennsylvania Dutch households throughout the 1700s and 1800s, where kitchen gardens routinely included a permanent bed of scarrot alongside other perennial staples. For a household without easy or affordable access to refined cane sugar, a naturally sweet root vegetable that required almost no ongoing labor once established was genuinely valuable. It sweetened porridge, it flavored tea, it gave children something naturally sweet to eat without a trip to a store or a general goods merchant. And because it was perennial, a family typically only had to acquire seed or root divisions once, And from that point forward, they simply dug up a portion of the established bed each fall, harvested what they needed, and replanted a piece of the crown to keep the cycle going indefinitely. So if it was this useful, this low maintenance, and this well established in American gardens for well over a century, the obvious question is exactly the one in this video's title. Why did it disappear? Why isn't it sitting on the shelf at your local garden center right next to the carrot and beet seed packets?
There isn't a single perfectly documented reason, and I want to be honest about that, rather than presenting this as settled historical fact, because it isn't. But there are a few genuinely plausible and reasonably well-supported explanations that likely work together. The most commonly cited theory, and one that shows up across several heirloom seed preservation sources, has to do with the economics of the commercial seed industry as it modernized through the late 1800s and early 1900s. Seed companies generally make their money through repeat sales, customers coming back and buying fresh seed packets year after year. An annual vegetable is, from a business standpoint, a naturally repeating sale. A perennial vegetable that a customer plants once and then propagates themselves for the rest of their life is, at best, a single transaction. As commercial seed catalogs became larger, more competitive, and more focused on crops that reliably generated seasonal repeat business, it's a reasonable and widely repeated theory that perennial vegetables like skirret simply became less commercially attractive to promote and stock, even if the plant itself was every bit as good as it had always been. But that's likely not the whole story, and it's worth mentioning the more practical horticultural reasons too, because these are better documented. Skirret has a genuine downside that a lot of the romanticized retellings of this story tend to leave out. The roots can be labor-intensive to harvest and prepare. Because the root grows as a cluster of thin fingers rather than one large taproot, harvesting means carefully digging up the entire crown and separating out each individual root, which are thinner and more fiddly to peel and clean than a single large carrot or parsnip. Compared to a crop like the potato, which produces large, easy-to-handle tubers, skirret is simply more labor per pound of harvested food. As American agriculture and home gardening shifted through the 20th century toward crops that were faster, easier to mechanize, and simpler to process at scale, a fussier, labor-intensive root likely lost ground for practical reasons just as much as commercial ones. Whatever the exact mix of causes, the practical result was the same. Skirret quietly faded from mainstream seed catalogs over the course of the early to mid-1900s. It wasn't banned, it wasn't outlawed, it didn't fail as a crop, it simply stopped being commercially prioritized. And without catalog visibility keeping it in front of home gardeners, an entire generation grew up never hearing its name, let alone tasting it.
Here's the good news, and the actual reason this video exists at all. It never actually disappeared. National and international seed preservation efforts, including government-maintained germplasm collections designed specifically to safeguard genetic diversity in food crops, have kept skirret's genetics alive and available this entire time, even during the decades it was essentially invisible to the average home gardener. And more importantly for you, a small number of dedicated heirloom and specialty seed companies have continued growing, saving, and selling both skirret seed and root divisions all along. If you want to actually grow this yourself, here's specifically where to start looking. Heirloom-focused seed retailers that specialize in rare and historic vegetable varieties are your best bet. Several well-known heirloom seed companies in the United States carry skirret seed or root divisions seasonally, though availability can be limited, so it's worth searching directly for skirret seed or Siam Cisarum seed online, rather than expecting to find it at a big-box garden center. Some specialty perennial vegetable nurseries also occasionally offer root divisions, which, as we'll get into, are actually the more reliable way to start this plant compared to seed.
Now let's get into actually growing it, because there are a few things worth knowing before you commit a corner of your garden to this. You have two realistic options for starting skirret: seed or root divisions, and they come with very different experiences.
Starting from seed is possible, but it comes with a real challenge. Germination is notoriously slow and inconsistent. Skirret seed typically benefits from a process called cold stratification before it will germinate reliably. If you're not familiar with that term, here's what it actually means and how you do it. Cold stratification simply means exposing the seed to a period of cold, moist conditions that mimics winter, which triggers a natural dormancy breaking response in many perennial and cold climate plant seeds. In practice, this means one of two things. Either you sow the seed directly outdoors in fall, letting a real winter do the stratification naturally, with germination then occurring the following spring as the soil warms, or if you're starting seed indoors or in a different season, you mix the seed with a small amount of slightly damp sand or peat moss, seal it in a bag or container, and refrigerate it for roughly 4 to 6 weeks before sowing, essentially simulating that same winter cold artificially. Even after proper stratification, expect germination to take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, and expect it to be somewhat uneven, some seeds sprouting well before others. Given that inconsistency, a lot of gardeners find it considerably easier and more reliable to start from root divisions instead, which several heirloom growers who carry skirret seed also sell alongside it. A root division is exactly what it sounds like, a small piece cut from an already established crown, typically including a bit of root and at least one growth bud. Planted directly in soil, a division establishes considerably faster and more predictably than seed does, since you're essentially starting with a small, already viable plant rather than beginning entirely from scratch. Whichever method you choose, here's what skirret wants once it's in the ground. Loose, well-draining soil with a reasonable amount of organic matter worked in gives the root system the best chance to develop properly without forking or becoming stunted, similar in principle to how you'd prepare soil for carrots or parsnips. Space plants roughly 12 inches apart, giving each crown's cluster of roots enough room to develop without competing directly with its neighbors. Skirret does well in full sun, but tolerates partial shade reasonably well too, making it a flexible option for a garden bed that doesn't get ideal light all day. Consistent moisture through the growing season matters, particularly in the first year while the plant is establishing its root system, though established plants become considerably more drought-tolerant over time.
Now, the timeline, because this is genuinely important, and it's the single biggest thing to understand before you plant this expecting a quick harvest. Skirret is a slow, patient crop. Most sources agree that a newly planted crown, whether started from seed or division, needs a full growing season, spring through fall, simply to establish itself, and often produces a better, more substantial harvest in its second year rather than its first. If you're starting from seed in spring, realistically expect your first meaningful harvest the following fall, roughly a year and a half after planting, rather than the same autumn. If you're starting from an already established root division, you may get a modest harvest in that first fall, but a genuinely good harvest, comparable to what an established bed produces, typically comes in year 2 and beyond, once the crown has had a full cycle to build up energy and root mass. This is exactly why skirret rewards the same kind of patience as asparagus or rhubarb. It's not a crop for someone who wants a fast return this season. It's a crop for someone willing to invest a season or two of patience in exchange for a bed that then keeps producing, largely on its own, for years afterward. As for hardiness, skirret is genuinely cold tolerant once established, generally considered reliably hardy through USDA zones 3 through 8, meaning the vast majority of the continental United States falls comfortably within its range.
In colder zones, a layer of mulch over the crown through the coldest part of winter provides extra insurance, though established plants in even fairly harsh winter climates typically come back reliably on their own each spring without much additional protection needed. Harvest itself happens in fall, ideally after the plant has experienced at least one light frost, since cold exposure tends to sweeten root vegetables generally. The same starch-to-sugar conversion that improves the flavor of carrots, parsnips, and kale also seems to benefit skirret. Dig up the entire crown carefully with a garden fork rather than pulling, since the thin root fingers snap easily if you try to yank them straight out of firm soil. Once you've got the crown out, separate the individual root fingers you want to eat, and then take the remaining crown, ideally with a few smaller root fingers and at least one healthy growth bud still attached, and replant it back into the same spot, or a new one if you'd like to expand your bed. This is the entire secret to skirret's perennial nature. You're never truly starting over, you're simply harvesting most of the roots each fall, while leaving enough of the crown intact to regenerate again the following year. In the kitchen, skirret is genuinely versatile. Peeled and boiled or roasted, it has a soft, starchy texture similar to parsnip, with that same natural sweetness coming through even more once cooked. It works well mashed, similar to how you'd prepare a sweet potato, or roasted whole with a bit of oil until the exterior caramelizes slightly. Raw and thinly sliced, it makes an unusual and genuinely pleasant addition to a salad, offering a natural sweetness that most raw root vegetables simply don't have. Some historical accounts even describe it being used to sweeten porridge or tea directly, essentially functioning as a mild, natural sugar substitute in households that either couldn't easily access refined sugar or simply preferred not to rely on it.
So, where does that leave things? Skirret isn't some mythical lost plant that no longer exists, and it's not something that was deliberately hidden from you. It's a genuinely useful, sweet, low-maintenance perennial vegetable that fell out of commercial favor for a mix of business and practical reasons. Likely some combination of the repeat sale economics of the seed industry and the simple fact that it's a bit more labor to harvest and clean than a single large root. It quietly stopped being profitable to promote, and without visibility in mainstream seed catalogs, most people alive today simply never had the chance to learn it existed in the first place. But the seed never actually vanished. It's sitting in preservation collections. It's available, in limited quantities, from a handful of dedicated heirloom seed sellers who've kept it alive this entire time. All it's ever really been waiting on is somebody willing to look past the empty shelf at a regular garden center and go find it. If you've got a corner of your garden you're not using for much, average soil, a bit of sun, and you're willing to give a perennial bed a season or two to properly establish itself, skirret is genuinely worth trying. Plant it this year, be patient through the first season while it builds its root system, and by next fall or the fall after, you'll be digging up a root that, by most accounts, really does taste like biting into an apple dipped in honey, grown from a plant that, once established, essentially takes care of itself for years to come. If you end up growing this, or if your own family happened to grow something like this generations back that's since disappeared from most gardens, I'd genuinely like to know. Drop it in the comments. What did your grandparents grow that you don't see anyone growing anymore? And if this is the first time you're hearing skirret's name, now you know it, and now you know exactly where to start looking if you want to grow it yourself.